In 2023, Winstone Wallboards will open its new jib plasterboard manufacturing and distribution facility in Tauriko, Tauranga. Tauranga is New Zealand's 5th largest city and is the fastest growing regional economy. It is New Zealand's fastest growing regional job market and home to the largest, most efficient port in the country. The new Winstone Wallboards plant will be based at the Tauriko Business Park, 10 kilometres from Tauranga City. It will be built on 12.8 hectares of land, making it 2.5 times bigger than the current site. Designed with sustainability at the forefront, this plant will be a significant step forward towards Fletcher Building's goal of reducing carbon emissions by 2030. The new plant will have extensive recycling capability on site for water and waste. It will also include new state-of-the-art technology and equipment, enabling the business to manufacture the full range of our jib plasterboard products with a high degree of flexibility. Automated processes will also ensure increased enhancement of the safety and manufacturing processes. The new Winstone Wallboards facility reinforces our commitment to manufacturing in New Zealand, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you.
Good evening, kia ora, good evening. Welcome to this Fast Forwards lecture series for 2022, Urban Design and Social Responsibility. My name is Dr. Lee Beattie. I'm the head of the School of Architecture and Planning. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here to the first of our first three for this part of the year, and then we've got three others lined up following the same sort of theme in the second half of the year. We've got three really interesting lectures to kick off with for this part of the year. Well, I'll come to the one we're going to do tonight in a moment, but after that, we've got Lee Alton and talking about light rail and the implications of that in terms of TODs and social regeneration that could provide for Auckland. Then after that, we've got the idea of returning and thinking about TODs and returning to the local and dealing with growth management issues and from a social sustainable point of view. But today, this afternoon, tonight, thank you for coming. We have the absolute pleasure of having Diane Brand here to talk about her life experiences, going from being Miss Mondrian's architectural journey from a creative house to creative industry, a courtyard house to creative industries. Diane was once the dean here at the University of Auckland. She's got over 45 years architecture experience, transversing public sector, hydroelectricity, public works, and here at the university, a graduate of Harvard, and I have to say one of the best deans we've actually had at this and here at the university, dealing with ourselves at the school. So without further ado, I'll pass over to her, and she's going to go through and discuss her life journey and how she went from the age of 12 wanting to be an architect and how that's gone through her life experiences and all the things we've just talked about in her own way. And she's going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to have a session for questions. And if you would like to have a question, please do that. Just put them in the Q&A box, and we'll read them out as we go along. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Diane. And also, this is also a part of her process of finishing her role as Dean, as her extraordinary lecturer. So it's great to have you, Diane. And again, we really thank you for your opportunity to come along and speak to us today.
Thanks, Lee. Kia ora tātou and nau mai haere mai, and a special welcome to my colleagues in Kai. I don't miss the job as Dean, but I do miss the people. As Lee said, this lecture was supposed to be held last year just prior to my retirement. As it turned out, I have moved on to another position in the university, and I now work in the Office of the Vice-Chancellor as Director of Academic Reviews, which is a very enjoyable job to have after being in such a demanding role in creative arts and industries. So tonight I'm going to talk about my career in architecture, which has been quite varied. I've done lots of different aspects of architecture, and I'll start with my childhood. So in 1950, my parents were married and they built a house on a a very steep hillside in Melrose. This was the home my father and my uncle built. It's the one at the top of the hill. And it was a state advances home. And in the post-war period, people could borrow money from state advances and they could use a set of plans that were issued by the state advances office. And my father, in fact, commissioned an architect who he'd been at school with, and they customized one of these plans to this very challenging site. As I was saying before, it was at the top of Houghton Valley, which is in South Wellington, and it was close to my mother's parents who had immigrated from Northern Ireland and run a grocery shop in that area. So that was the first home I had, which had links to, you know, the design heritage of state homes in New Zealand. The photo on the right is me going to or standing in the front yard of that house, about to go to the church fancy dress competition. And of course, the sign, First Woman in Space, had to be there because it was in 1961 that the Russians had put a man in space. But no one in their right minds in those days ever contemplated a woman would be a pilot, let alone an astronaut. So we had the sign made up to make it clear what I was dressed up as. When I was 6, we moved down to the bottom of the hill, which was Lyle Bay. And my father, who ran an advertising agency in the sort of Cuba Street area in Wellington, commissioned Erwin Winkler from, I've forgotten the name of the firm now, but he commissioned Erwin Winkler to design a courtyard house for us. And it was this house, which was a classic Winkler house, being a courtyard and being quite compact, that really stimulated my interest in architecture. Even as a 6-year-old, I was very interested in seeing the drawings, and I remember my parents showing them to me. I used to hang around on the site and bother the builders to see what they were up to. So I really saw this building take shape, and then had the pleasure of living in it until I was 18 and came to university in Auckland. And also then later on, when I was head and dean at Victoria, we moved into the house and renovated it. Originally, the house had a colonial exterior because my parents kind of lost their nerve over the modernist exterior. And when I graduated from architecture school, we reskinned the house to make it look like, I think, Winkler might have designed it. I do remember as a 5-year-old seeing the drawings, but I can't remember clearly enough what the front facade looked like. So it was a bit of a guessing game, but it now feels more like a Winkler house than it did with a colonial facade. So in 1976, after doing an intermediate year at Victoria, I arrived in Auckland at the School of Architecture at Auckland University. In those days, it was a series of army huts stepping down the site, and there were 3 main studio groupings, which were sort of like studio subcultures, I suppose. And they were called timber, steel, and brick, and they represented different approaches to design and to architecture. And I was in the timber studio, which is the sawtooth roofed building just in front of St. Paul's. And when I was in first year, Fred Beckett and Cam McLean gave me the nickname Miss Mondrian because everything I designed was rectilinear and decked out in primary colours, and that name sort of stuck. So that, in fact, is where the title for this lecture comes from. So in those days, it was 4 years at University of Auckland, and and then graduating, I moved on from the rectilinear thing to the diagonal thing. And in fact, my thesis in my final year was called Aspects of the Diagonal. And these are some of the designs I did in final year, and you can see the influence of the diagonal in those. The photo on the right is me out at Carrington Tech helping build a house. We teamed up with some apprentices in the carpentry program out there and spent a week building a Neil home. And in fact, that was the closest we got to a building site the whole 4 years. So it was a very useful week. When I graduated, I went to work in the power division of the Ministry of Works. I had a Ministry of Works cadetship at university, and you got posted to various places upon graduation. Power division was an office that was set up specifically for the Ministry of Works to serve the client, New Zealand Electricity, who commissioned and ran the power stations across New Zealand. And it was an office of mainly engineers. It was located in head office in Aitken Street in Wellington. And my job was to really look after substations. And so that meant I designed a whole slew of elegant tin sheds, the smallest of which would have been a size of a room, and customize the design of substation buildings onto these sites around the country. It was a very interesting office to work in. I think it was the first woman to ever work in that office. And, you know, my first day at work, one of the older draftsmen was assigned to work with me, and he refused on the basis that I was a woman. So that was a great start. And then there were a group of drafting cadets who insisted on putting pin-ups all over the walls around their workspaces, and I went and ripped them all down again. So we had a bit of a rough beginning, but in the end, I really enjoyed that office. There was a good sense of camaraderie, which really was the culture of the projects in those days, and the people working out on the dam sites. This slide on the left is Benmore, and I later returned to study the hydro town attached to that. And the slide on the right is my favourite power station, which is Waipapa, designed by Chris Vallenduke. Some of these buildings are in the middle of nowhere, and I count them amongst some of the best buildings in the country, but no one ever sees them. While I was in Power Division, a commission came along to do a control building at the Otahu Power Station, and they gave me that job first up. So I spent a year designing and documenting that building, and then I was transferred to the Auckland District Office to supervise the construction of it. It was a sort of trial by fire, really, to do a building of that size straight out of university, but I certainly went on a very steep learning curve, and this building actually appears in Once Were Warriors in the drive-by of the Otahu Power Station, so it has some movie fame as well. Most of my work at the Auckland District Office involved doing repartitioning schemes for the State Services Commission, and they're not very spectacular office blocks. And so I was beginning to feel I was in a bit of an interior rut, which I think women often find themselves in architecture. But at one point I got to design this lovely little building at the satellite station in Warkworth. It's a very tiny visitor centre, but I had a fantastic team working with me on that, and we had a great deal of fun putting it together and seeing it built. This was just prior to me going off to America on a government scholarship. And I was at Harvard for 2 years doing their Masters of Architecture in Urban Design. And the first year was coursework, and then the second year we did a thesis, and I chose given that I was being funded by the government, I chose to do a thesis on the formal expression of government in Wellington. The thesis itself is fairly dated, but the central idea here was to connect via the government precinct, the hills and the sea. And that's a fairly archetypal idea for a New Zealand setting for a building of national importance. It was quite a difficult site to work with, and there are various axes of buildings that intersect with each other, the cathedral, the basilica, Parliament, and then it sort of cranks out through Old Government House down to the waterfront. I got a letter of recommendation for this thesis, which meant I was, one of the top submitters in the class. So it was, I found it a very rewarding exercise. Of course, it really didn't make any difference when I got home. No one was particularly interested in doing this to the government precinct. And so, it largely ended up being a theoretical exercise. Harvard was a very interesting experience. It was probably the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life, and I never want to work that hard again. I learned a lot about urban design, and it set me up as a good practitioner for urban design. But I think the main thing I learned, because of the volume of work that we were given, I think we had a hand in like every day. It was just relentless. I just learnt to get through that volume of work with a high degree of speed and a high degree of accuracy. And I think that speed and accuracy combination set me up very well for my work in the future. This is my graduation, and they graduated you before you left the country, so that was very convenient. I could actually take the degree with me. And the lovely woman on my left is my host mother, Julie Stefanian, and she and her family hosted me while I was in the States for 2 years, and we still keep in touch. And we now have a prize set up in honor of her and her husband, Tom, because of the generosity they showed us while we were in Cambridge. And the other person is Kanjani, my friend from the dormitory, who I knew for the period of us being at the Cronkite Centre together. I came back to New Zealand, but then very quickly moved on to private practice in Australia. I worked for some of the high-end practitioners there. Anchor, Mortlock and Woolley was one of those, and I worked on the interior of the concert hall at the ABC building in Ultimo. And you can see the interior of that concert hall in the cross section. This work was mainly around putting in submissions for competitions or working for developers, and I think this was the result of a competition job, but it was a strike rate of about 1 in 10, so we did an awful lot of projects that never came to fruition. While I was working with Anchor Mortlock, I also started working on the restoration of the Walsh Bay finger wharves, and this was a massive project run by the state government, and Mitchell, Jugler and Thorpe were also involved, along with a number of other firms, and it was really a project to restore those wharves, which were very dilapidated. They were originally wharves designed to ship wool from Australia to Europe, and we had to design all manner of different other functions into them, like offices, hotels. It was a really interesting project, the first time I'd really done anything in the heritage line. Unfortunately, the recession in the early 90s put the kibosh on it, and it didn't get revived until the mid-2000s, and it was then designed by a French architect. The building on the right is one I worked on as in site supervision. It was the A&A Hotel in the Rocks in Sydney, and hadn't been involved in the design of the project, but the Sydney office was overseeing the construction. Mitchell Jigger and Thorpe's head office was in Canberra because they had done the Parliament House there, and then they started an office in Sydney, which used to do most of the developer and competition work. Aldo Jurgler, the leader of the firm, didn't like coming to Sydney very much because, and he relegated all of the development work to the Sydney office because he, as he used to say, working with developers is like kissing a snake. So we didn't really see very much of Jurgler in the office, but certainly it was a pleasure to work with a group of people who were such good designers and really paid a lot of attention to the quality of the buildings that they worked on. We did a lot of other projects. This one on the left is a hotel design that we did for George Street. I think we did, God, millions of schemes for that. It just kept on going and going and going, and then it dropped off the table altogether. And it was only when I got back to New Zealand that I started doing urban design consulting work, and I did do some consulting with Architectus on the Viaduct Harbour when I was working as an academic. So moving into the teaching, I guess I got into teaching in an interesting way. When the project, the hotel project in the Rocks came to an end, there were 1,000 men on that site and about 6 women, and we all got laid off at the same time. And I really hadn't figured out what I was going to do next. And I got a phone call from an intern we'd had a few years earlier from Adelaide, and he said, look, we're looking for someone to teach design down here. Do you think you could do it? And I said, yes. I had a mortgage to pay. So, you know, off I went to Adelaide. And that's where I started my teaching career. It was just a short-term contract, so I needed to look for a more permanent position. And one came up in Auckland in '94, so I came back to Auckland and took up a permanent position in academia. The experience in Adelaide had taught me that it was really a very nice way to make quite a decent living. Working in architecture offices in Australia was not that interesting, I have to say. A lot of the work was stressful, boring, and you were working sometimes 80 hours a week, so you had no other life. And working on that construction site was also extremely dangerous. It was a very violent place. And of course, the whole contracting system is an adversarial process, so you felt somewhat like you were in combat all the time. So all of a sudden, I'm in Adelaide teaching people, and here I am in a role where I'm nurturing people, helping them learn. It was quite a revelation in terms of the difference in attitude required, and also the job satisfaction. So I was quite keen to then have a permanent career in academia. Also, it suited my objectives because I'd never really been able to apply the urban design knowledge that I learned at Harvard. I never used it in practice at all. So coming back to Auckland University enabled me to start teaching urban design and as well as architectural design. And so I felt very comfortable with that as a life decision as well. So I taught various different years at the School of Architecture. These are just some examples of studio work from students over the years. I like to combine good design and good theory with a real understanding of technology and how things were built, because I felt my own education had really not given me a good grounding in construction and in technology, and I felt disempowered as an architect because of that. So I didn't want my students to be in the same position. There's another couple of studios. I did one with Margaret, a studio with Margaret Holdaway from Film and Television Studies, and we taught the students how to make small movies and then also translate that into an architectural proposition via making a film studio. And of course, I was working with some very talented Brazilian architects, and we taught some Brazilian projects. At the same time, I met my husband, Rick Allender, and he's a cinematographer, so we were making movies about classic boats because we were heavily into the classic yachting scene as well. I actually went to Brazil and visited a creche in Bahia de Salvador de Bahia. And we taught another series of studios set in the favelas in that area. And then eventually there was a study tour that went to Brazil and traveled around and looked at all the fantastic architecture that they have there. I really liked teaching at master's level or at honours level as it was in Adelaide. And these are some of the Masters of Urban Design and Architecture projects that I taught over the years, looking at large scale projects in Auckland. Both of these happened to deal with water, and that was an evolving research interest of mine at the time. So I was getting students to experiment with those ideas in the studio. So about a little more than a decade after arriving in Auckland, Deirdre Brown, Rosangela Tenorio and I were awarded a Distinguished Teaching Award. And that was because of a set of projects that we'd run in studio that were catering to a more diverse student body that was then emerging at the School of Architecture. And Sarosh Muller, who's now lecturing also at the School of Architecture, was the student who read the citation for that work. So ground through the levels, lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, teaching studio, lecturing in urban design, undertaking research, which from about 2007 on, I started looking at what I call blue space, which was urban space related to water. This kind of came out of two things. I had been looking at, in my PhD thesis, at the journeys, the voyages of people who got to New Zealand and the places they stopped off. And, you know, a couple of those were places that had very interesting relationships between the city and the water, being Cape Town and Rio de Janeiro. So, and I also started sailing at the age of 45, and I started to see space from the water in a different way. So that dominated my research for some time, trying to categorize the different types of space that related to water and how the transition occurred between a land-based urban space and a water space. 2008, I went down to Victoria University as firstly the head of school and later the dean. During my time there, we entered the solar decathlon competition, which required students, a group of students, to design, build and ship a small building to Washington and then run it environmentally for a week and keep it cool and functioning, have enough power and all the rest of it. So this was what they called the first lighthouse. It was a lovely little building designed by 4 very talented students. And I think from memory, it won 3rd prize in the solar decathlon, competition, which was pretty amazing since, you know, we'd shipped it all the way from New Zealand, not without some difficulty. And we later entered it for a international award at the NZAA Awards and won one of those as well. So that was probably the highlight of my deanship at Victoria. I then returned to Auckland as dean in 2013, and at that stage I got very interested again in the hydro towns, which is where I started with the power division and started looking at how these towns were planned. And it emerged that not only were the buildings kit set buildings, and they were really based on the design of a workman's tent from the 19th century, but the componentry that went into these different towns up and down the country was all very similar, and they just pieced together different units and put them in place on whatever site they were developing as a hydroelectric project. So that research was also really interesting, going back and revisiting all those dams. I have to confess I'm a bit of a dam junkie. Whenever I'm driving down country, I have to stop in and see all the dams on the way, because I'm just so fascinated by this whole rollout of infrastructure, which was kind of behind the scenes, but involved enormous energy and hard work, and produced some pretty interesting buildings at the same time. So being a dean's pretty stressful. So one of the things I did and still do to de-stress is to make jewelry. And because of the boat thing, I started looking at using boating materials to make jewelry, and started a jewelry business called Nautical Tribe. The problem with this was that the material to make these necklaces was inordinately expensive, because the rope is designed to hold, you know, 15 tons of boat, not just to go around someone's neck. So I found that I couldn't recoup the costs in making this jewelry. So I then moved on to another type of jewelry, which I'll look at later. While I was Dean of Creative Arts and Industries, I think my main achievement was to, well, keep this faculty solvent during, you know, resource cuts that went on for years and years and years, and are still going on. But also to revitalise the degree programs, to make them less elitist and more relevant to the workplace, and to benchmark them against international degrees of the same kind. And the highlight was introducing the design degrees in 2021, 2020. And I think we've got a good suite of degrees in the faculty. The only degrees we didn't touch were the dance ones, but we did work on a dual master's degree with the Beijing Dance Academy, which was a major undertaking and proved to be a very, very good move in terms of international engagement. I did a lot of traveling to meet international partners, to teach and to meet alumni. The group on the left is the Taipei graduates, who I tried to meet at least once a year when I was up there teaching at the University of Taipei. And top middle is Max Gimblett and I in his studio in New York. He's a person that I regularly met when I did my week in New York every year to fundraise. Ralph and Deirdre and I in New Delhi, we were talking to Indian universities about setting up agreements and arrangements to exchange students. And that was early 2019. And then Ralph and I, inside I've forgotten what it's called, inside a yurt in Kyrgyzstan, we were negotiating agreements with the University of Central Asia through the Aga Khan Foundation, and those negotiations and relationships are ongoing. After the Christchurch earthquakes, I started looking in terms of my research into public space and how destroyed space was used by community groups as public spaces in Christchurch, and that was a fairly interesting study. Unfortunately, the rebuilt Christchurch is not looking anywhere near as interesting as these spaces looked in the early days after the earthquake. And back to the jewelry. This is Ruby Rocket jewelry. Ruby Rocket is my beautiful Bengal cat. I finally found the right mix of cost of materials and jewelry design, using very ordinary materials like wall plugs and weed eater cord. And the project with the wooden pieces in it is a collaborative project I did with artist Nola Gregory and Current Dean for the Seed Gallery Christmas competition. And I'm now using much more recycled material in the jewelry because getting deliveries from China is getting exceptionally difficult. So that's where I'm at, happy in my retirement, making jewelry, working 1 day a week. And I can't resist the 2-second commercial here, that the website there, you can buy my jewelry if you want to. So that's really it. I'll take some questions if there are any. I'm sure there are. I can see things on the chat.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was an incredible journey through your life and so many interesting things, especially the thing from a personal point of view, the bit about Welsh Bay. I didn't know you were involved in that. As a graduate of Sydney, been involved in some projects in Welsh Bay myself when I was at University of Sydney. I didn't know you were involved. So and after all these years, I've learned something about this, and that's the pleasure of coming to these things. So what a great thing. And that leads straight into the first question we have here from Lou, and says, what an impressive things during your journey you've introduced today. What was the most impressive thing? What was the most important thing you've done in that journey you've just gone through for us today?
I don't know, it's all been interesting. I mean, I think it's important to realize that your interests change over your life. And I've never been someone who wants to repeat things over and over and over. So it's been dynamic deliberately because I like changing and, you know, doing different things. I don't know, it's hard to say really. I mean, I guess the first lighthouse was quite a big thing because it was an international recognition of New Zealand design, and that New Zealand students could really, you know, get out there and do world-class things.
Okay, really good. Next question. If you had to choose only one role, what would it be? And for someone who wanted to be an architect or urban design, what would you recommend them where to start? So if you had to choose one of those roles that you've been through, incredible things that you've done, which would it be? And how would you start someone on the journey to be an architect or an urban designer?
I couldn't just choose one. It's not in my nature. I'm continually moving in and out of different things. And I don't think it's realistic anymore to think that you can have a sole issue career. I think it's, well, not only is it, it's probably less possible these days for a younger generation, but I don't know, it always seems to me a bit unsatisfactory that we dedicate major chunks of our life to doing one thing when there's such a variety of things going on. I don't know, I suppose, yeah, interests change too. I mean, at one stage I would have said teaching was fantastic. I really enjoyed it and I really loved it, but I also enjoyed management and I also enjoyed designing. I suppose the one activity I like doing is designing, and whether that's designing a curriculum or designing a piece of jewelry or designing a house or designing a public space, that's the activity I like doing. And you know, you have to find different ways of getting that outlet for that creative instinct, I suppose.
And so what would be your recommendation to start someone on the second part onto their life as an architect or an urban designer? Apart from, I'd say come and study urban design at the university, of course, but apart from that, what would you say?
It's interesting. I just had a conversation this afternoon with a graduate who's at a crossroads in their career. And I guess my advice was, you can't always design your own career. Things don't always happen the way you want them to. So you have to kind of keep yourself or have the ability to move into different opportunities if they arise. And I think it's important to keep as many skills in your skill set as you can for as long as you can, so that you do have more choices as things come and go. I mean, you can go for, saying to this person this afternoon, you can go for decades without anything really significant happening or feeling frustrated in a job, and then all of a sudden, bang, something happens and you're on a new track. So I suppose, it can be frustrating, but patience is a virtue, as my father used to say. I still haven't achieved that virtue myself, but
I think we're also working on that one. The next one I think is really, really interesting and something I know is close to your heart. What do you see as the future for architectural design, especially in terms of the climate crisis that we face? Where do you see the profession going in terms
well,
of?
it's absolutely where we should be doing our research. It's where we should be doing our work. We should be leading this. We have the design skills to lead this in our profession, and we should be taking a much more active role in doing so. And that includes the academy. I mean, we should be teaching this in a much more serious way at all levels, and we should be researching it. So yeah, I mean, if we don't, engineers are going to get to jump on us, as they always usually do, and become the main spokespeople in the design space for this. And they haven't got the broad design skills that we've got. And I'd say the same applies to social equity in housing. I think that's another major issue that's facing Auckland, and it's an issue that architects should be at the front of.
And sort of taking that and putting back to this incredible journey you've just taken us through, how do you see that playing out in terms of our water provision, our lake provisions, and all the hydro dams and hydro towns you've talked about?
What, you mean that they're no longer fashionable and it's not?
No. What does that mean in terms of climate change? What does that mean in terms of all the things we've done and for those spaces? How's it going to impact on those as well?
Well, we have to understand and study how it is going to impact and make the modifications necessary, or retreat. In certain instances, it will be a retreat exercise. But yeah, we need to, I mean, it's everything from designing gutterings on roofs and roof pitches to, looking at hydro lakes and, how they're going to perform in a new climate.
Yeah,
but we desperately need this research to be done, and it doesn't seem to be coming from our profession.
So another question just is, where is your Turanga Waiwai? Where's your place in the world? Where do you see yourself standing at?
Well, I mean, I'm a Wellingtonian still. I see myself. Well, you can't help where you're born. It's a great place. So yeah, and I suppose, my ancestors are Irish, Northern Irish, Scottish, and I'm a 5th generation New Zealander on one side. So I guess I'm, firmly placed as a Kiwi, but with those roots.
So just from while waiting for another question coming from my own heart as an urban designer like yourself, where do you think the future of that profession is going and the challenges it faces?
Well, it really has to look at climate change. I mean, whole areas of cities are going to be inundated or changed as a result of climate. So that's the number one design exercise. It's not seats and street lamps and, pretty little corporate plazas and things. It's how are we going to deal with this? What are the planning responses? What are the alternative planning responses, design responses we need to look at? And it has to be based on scientific evidence, not on, not on a sense of, often we base a design on a theoretical idea. This has to be based on, the constraints that we have that are emerging on a scientific basis.
we have any other questions we'd like to ask Diane while we've got this opportunity? Any other questions? Anyone would like to ask? Just making sure I've covered everything in the chats here. I've got some commentary here saying, wow, what a career. All scales, very interesting to hear. And I think we can all agree with that. Is there any other questions you'd like to have from the floor? I know it's on Zoom and it's not the same as being in person. Don't be afraid, don't be shy if you have any questions you'd like to ask. I don't think there is. Is there anything you'd like to say? I mean, I just, from a personal level, I'd just like to thank you, and I'm sure that goes for my colleagues, as you said, in Kai, and especially here in the school. Given you have a long relationship with the school, for all the leadership and everything you've provided. It was always a pleasure working with you on a personal level, and I'm sure all the others would say the same thing. We miss you. So I just don't want to say what a fantastic career you've had, and it's great that in a way you're still around. And we were just talking before we started this project that you're still helping myself and Eating out in our studios and the Urban Design Studios, and we really hope that you continue to keep doing that sort of stuff. I know you find teaching hard, issues, but it's great to have you. So I just wanted to say thank you on a personal level as well, and I'm sure all my colleagues would say the same thing. And just wish you all the best for the future that you've done and where you're going.
Thanks, Lee. It's been a wonderful career, particularly at the University of Auckland. I mean, I was a student there. I became a researcher there. I became a teacher there. I became a manager there. I've got a lot of fond memories of the university, and I'm quite happy to have dedicated a major part of my life to it and to the students.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say? Because otherwise, I don't think we have any questions, apart from we've got a lot of people thanking you, as I say, colleagues, your colleagues thanking you for your time and all the support you've given to us over the years. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Because it's sort of hard to, it's sort of, from my point of view, and I'm sure from all our point of views as staff here, it's sort of not the same without you. Not that it's not good now or anything like that.
It's not the same without you either.
But you know what I'm trying to say. It's lovely with what things are, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's a void, and it's.
Well, you do get to the stage in your career where it is time to hand over to a younger generation of people, and that's you. And it's things are changing quite fast at the universities. They're changing quite fast in society, and at a certain point you get change fatigue. And I must admit COVID was the real thing that fatigued me in the last couple of years, trying to manage the usual circus with COVID on top of it was really just beyond expectations on occasions. Hopefully you've got a better handle on it now, but the first year was, hair raising. So, but, I thank you all for being wonderful colleagues, and particularly the people who worked with me in the faculty office and were on the management teams and the execs, all, I have to say, out of all the teams I've worked in my career, and I've worked in many, that was the best team that I ever worked with. And it's a rare thing to have such a good team of people all, heading in the same direction. So thank you.
Okay, just one last question that's come out, which I think is really actually important, so I will ask it to you. What do you think is the interface between architects and scientists? I think that's a really interesting question.
Well, I think they need to talk to each other a lot more. And, I think if scientists can encapsulate their concerns and their research in a way that architects can absorb and then design using their talents, I think we've got a really good chance of cracking some of these intangible problems that we're facing. But they're not a community that we actually interact with a lot. And I guess it's the same in academia. Everything has to become more transdisciplinary. You've got to understand such a range of things now to really get the answer right. It's no longer a one action game. You've got multiple things going on. And so another thing we really need to teach young students to do is to work in teams. They must know how to, and to lead them, and not just to work in them, to lead them in a capable way. And I don't think we do teach that very well at the moment. And it's, you know, it's not a skill that we mark or evaluate during their degree, but it is a really important skill that they need to use as professionals.
I think, and that's the thing, is we're training, especially in this school, and of course other parts of the faculty, but in this school, we are training urban professionals to work in multidisciplinary teams, and that's what happens every day in practice, as you and I know. You're working with a range of different skill sets: scientists, ecologists, engineers, planners, urban designers, all you know, economists, all sorts of people, and we need to give them those sort of skills to be able to work in that space, don't we?
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems too is that, you know, architects have tremendous skills in integrating information and synthesizing it and coming out with ideas. And, you know, we're unique in the sense that we have a lateral thinking process, whereas engineers and scientists are linear thinkers. And you've got to somehow combine those two ways of thinking to get a better result, because, I mean, my experience, you know, we did some projects a couple of years ago with the engineering school, you know, that we were solving a particular problem, and, you know, the three architects in the room went, oh, well, why don't we do this, this, and this? And the engineers just looked at us and said, God, where did that come from? Because it wasn't a linear thought process. It was just, you know, and it's like, I realized at that moment that we do have extremely valuable contributions to make, but the people that we interact with don't necessarily understand that we can do it. So we have to be better at selling our skills, but we also, and demonstrating it. But it's a value add proposition. And, you know, everybody is talking about design thinking and design this and that in the business circles at the moment, but all they're doing is following a process that you follow to design something. They're not being taught to be creative. And we are, so we have a unique role in the future. But it's just getting a bit of airtime and some prominence in a political sense as well. I mean, you know, these spaces politically are dominated by other professions, and that needs to change.
Yeah. So I think on that really salient note, which I couldn't agree with you more, I think we'd just like to, well, if we were in the room, we could all clap, but unfortunately we're on Zoom, but just thank you. But we all do that virtually. Thank you very much for your time, and, you know, for that expose of what a wonderful career you've had, and it's just been fantastic. And again, just as I say, on behalf of our colleagues here at the school and the faculty, it's been great to have you. It's sad, as I say, it's sad to see you go. But as I also just want to say that Eating and I will keep using you, as we just discussed before in the studio. So don't worry, you still can come back and teach urban design with us as well.
Oh, we could always arrange to have you review, Lee. We could do one of your schools, and then you'd see me for, you know,
yeah, for ages.
For more than you'd ever want to see me.
And we must also keep those Taiwanese connections going as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so, well, thanks for having me to give this lecture. It's been a nice thing to do, and I really appreciate your involving me.
So thanks very much to everyone who's tuned in today. I'd just like to thank our sponsors, Jib, very much. Thank you very much for your sponsorship and ongoing support of the Fast Forward series. That's the first in the first three for this semester. And then, as I say, we've got three more coming up with some international speakers coming up in the second semester, which we're just working through the details now. I'd like to all encourage you to join us on the 31st of May when we have Lee Orton and co, who's the director or chair of the Light Rail, Auckland Light Rail project, to talk to us about that project and what that could mean, especially in terms of the urban regeneration that could provide along that corridor. And what we would like to really explore with him is those social implications of tides and such like. So without further ado, again, I'd just like to thank you, Diane, for your time, your appreciation, everything you've done. And I thank everyone in the audience for coming in today. Look forward to seeing you on Tuesday, the 31st of May at 6 p.m. to listen to Ian Orton talk about light rail. Probably one of the biggest infrastructure projects that's coming forward to Auckland. If it does manifest itself, I think we're talking about $14 billion of investment in that project. So it'd be interesting to hear what he has to say. So on that note, everyone have a lovely night. Thank you, Diane, and we'll see you all on the 31st of May to hear Lee Orton. Thank you very much.